Hi everybody, my name is Griffin Callahan and welcome to my presentation. I'm going to be walking you through an evaluation that was done on a randomized controlled trial to test the effectiveness of mindfulness-based stress reduction on veterans with PTSD. So to start off, we are going to talk about the program description. So to start off with, again, it was a randomized controlled trial. That is an experimental evaluation design. In the program, there were 116 veterans enrolled with PTSD, and they were screened using inclusion and exclusion criteria in a Minneapolis VA medical center. All of the inclusion and exclusion criteria were applied to all of the patients. If you met the inclusion criteria, you had the chance to be included. And if you met some of the exclusion criteria, then obviously you were excluded from the experiment. So 58 of the 116 participants were placed into a mindfulness-based stress reduction therapy, which is the experimental group in this case, and 58 participants were placed into a present-centered group therapy session, stress reduction PTSD therapy, which is basically the standard of care at the time that this was written. So the mindfulness-based participants had to go to 8 weekly 2.5 hour group sessions and a day-long retreat where they were subjected to several different types of therapy, including a full day of no talking to each other but reflection, and also yoga and various other physical activities. And then the present-centered group were subjected to 9 weekly 1.5 hour group sessions focused on life problems where they discussed in a group what they were experiencing, how they could relate to one another, etc. And then there were check-ins by the authors of the study in weeks 3, 6, 9, and 17 on all of the participants to see what their progress was. So some of the outcome measures, there were primary and secondary outcome measures. The primary was a reduction in PTSD symptom severity. Actually, it was not a reduction, it was just the change in PTS symptom severity. And it was based on the criteria set out in the DSM-4, which is the standard of how to diagnose people with mental disorders in America and around the world, actually. Secondary outcome measures were the status of the PTSD diagnosis. So there were a lot of participants in both groups that actually fell out of PTSD diagnosis because of their decrease in PTS symptom severity scores. And additionally, there was another secondary outcome measure that was the PTSD symptom severity assessed through improvements in depression, quality of life, and mindfulness. So some of the things that were measured were the between group effect sizes, and those were computed between the mindfulness-based and present-centered stress reduction therapy groups. And then there was a power analysis. There were power analyses calculated for PTSD severity scores, which was the primary outcome again that was being measured. So some of the study conclusions were that the mindfulness-based stress reduction group showed a greater improvement in PTSD score reduction than the present-centered therapy patients. So an example of that is the fact that there was a mean score change from 63.6 to 55.7 in mindfulness group and 58.8 to 55.8 in the present-centered therapy group. Additionally, mindfulness-based participants were also more likely to show clinically significant improvements in PTSD symptom severity than the present-centered patients by over 20%. A mindfulness-based participants did not show significant difference from present-based participants in loss of PTSD diagnosis at a 2-month follow-up. So there were actually there was a higher percentage of mindfulness-based participants that actually showed a loss of PTSD diagnosis, but it was not statistically significant, which was something that the authors were particular to note to the readers so that they weren't influenced too heavily by the conclusions that I'm talking about right now. And overall, the mindfulness-based stress reduction therapy resulted in a statistically significant reduction in PTSD symptom severity when compared with the present-centered therapy sessions. However, they were modest improvements in PTSD severity and should warrant further trials, which is, again, is what I was trying to mention a second ago, that the authors wanted the readers to note before drawing too heavy of significance on these conclusions. So the 6 threats to validity that need to be assessed in every single evaluation are threats to objectivity, internal design validity, threats to statistical conclusion validity, construct validity, external validity, and utilization. So these are, again, the 6 types of validity threats that need to be taken into account, and their descriptions are listed here for anyone to read. However, because we're all in this class together, I'm going to go on to the next slide so I don't waste too much time for you guys. So the way that I did my own threat assessment was by going through each of the categories of threats to validity, and there were a series of questions asked in each one, and you scored both the seriousness of the threat to validity, which is the top line, and the importance of this threat to the evaluation based on the score that was given here. So a score of 1 meant that the seriousness of the threat was not very significant, and a score of 5 is the most significance of the threat to validity. Additionally, the importance of this threat to the evaluation is scored on the same scale, 1 meaning that it is not that important to the threat to threaten the evaluation, and a 5 meant that it presented a serious threat to evaluation. So after going through, I got the mean score for all of these, and as you can see, for the overall conclusion that I drew from this paper, I saw that there were not many statistically significant, or there were not many significant threats to validity or importance of the threat to the evaluation in all 6 of these categories. However, I did note some of the more important individual categories in each of these threats that may impact the overall evaluation of this study. So the 6 key operational issues that I noted were they're all listed here. So there's 1 in objectivity, 1 threat to statistical conclusion validity. There's a threat to statistical conclusion validity or external validity. It could be found in either one of those threats. Construct validity has 2 of these threats, and then utilization has 1. So the objectivity threat is that the author clearly has some sort of bias towards mindfulness-based stress reduction, which could influence the conclusions or the overall study. The threat to statistical conclusion validity is that there's a small sample size, which may lead to overassumptions. There is no geographic diversity in study participants, which is both a threat to statistical conclusion validity and external validity. Another construct validity is a hint of a mono-method bias in the fact that they only look at PTSD and its outcomes in the study patients. All 3 of the primary and secondary outcomes all dealt with PTSD scores. Another construct validity threat is that there may be a setting-based issue in controlling outcomes, meaning that the setting of both of the types of therapy were not taken into account enough, in my opinion, by the authors to show that the setting may have influenced some of these patients. In particular, one that was in the mindfulness base that tried to commit suicide. We don't know what type of setting may have caused that issue in the day-long retreat that the patient tried to commit suicide in. Finally, a utilization issue is that the study did not produce significant enough outcomes to affect policy decisions, which again just means that there needs to be more studies done on this to see if there is statistically significant enough reason to implement more mindfulness-based therapy sessions rather than present-centered ones. So overall, my thoughts and recommendations are that this was a very well-designed randomized control trial. It accounted for most of the threats to validity. It did not allow biases, and for the most part, to affect conclusions drastically. It accounted for more than one variable measurement and reduced objectivity validity to a minimum. My recommendations going forward are that you increase the sample size of this study, expand participation pool to several different VA medical centers around the country so that geographic differences are taken into account, and then expand the variable measurements to include one more outcome that may not have to do necessarily with PTSD scores based on the DSM-4, but an overall assessment of the patient rather than um, just the quality of life, like we were talking about before, that were taken into account. So this was my presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope you learned something. I'm also looking forward to hearing your feedback on this and my discussion question that I'll be posting. Thank you so much.